Indigenous knowledge or indigenous systems in Cameroon. There is currently a renaissance of interest in indigenous knowledge after a long period of neglect and disdain by Western scientific and academic establishments. However, educational institutions have not met some of the more fundamental changes required to successfully integrate indigenous knowledge. Interventions and programs in early childhood development similarly tend to be based on an accepted body of knowledge built on Western experience and practices. The early childhood development takes a very different approach to capacity building. Its curriculum is built around the idea of co-construction of knowledge, requiring the participation of all in the creation and dissemination of content. The initial result of this process of generating curriculum within concrete cultural contexts are encouraging. The participants in the early childhood development program recognize the value of indigenous knowledge and are actively pursuing the documentation and incorporation of this knowledge into their research and program activities in the field of early childhood development. This article presents arguments in favor of incorporating indigenous knowledge into the early childhood development field and highlights the work of a number of early childhood development participants contributing to this area. The paradigm shift. After decades of development, research, and practice in the majority world based primarily on the Western scientific canoe, a paradigm shift has begun that looks towards indigenous knowledge to supplement, integrate with, and at times even supplement the previous approach. In practice, the collection and documentation of local practices and knowledge by outsiders has taken place for as long as people have been traveling the globe and recording their observations. However, despite being built upon a long history of the exchange of indigenous knowledge, by the middle of the 20th century, the Western scientific paradigm had developed an approach that was relatively insular, universalizing, and exclusionary. Although there continued to be an interest in local practices and cultures, primarily in the field of anthropology, both scientific and policy-oriented research in development appear to lose respect for indigenous knowledge and advocate the wholesale adoption of Western scientific models as the best solution to development problems. By the mid-1980s, the socio-economic situation of Africa had not responded to the modernist development approach in the ways envisioned by the proponents of modernization theory. Lees, 1996. In academic and policy circles, there arose several divergent new approaches to solving the African crisis. At the two extreme poles were neoliberal economics and post-structuralized analysis. Despite great differences between the paradigms, the majority of scholarship on Africa shared a renewed interest in participatory development and the incorporation of indigenous knowledge into development practice. The most commonly cited definition of indigenous knowledge is that of Louis Graner, 1998. He defines indigenous knowledge as a unique, traditional, local knowledge existing within and developed around the specific conditions of women and men, indigenous to a particular geographic area. Arguments in favor of recognizing the importance of indigenous knowledge range from those based on philosophical principles to those derived from more utilitarian, pragmatic rationales. On the side of principles, There is recognition of the intrinsic value of cultural diversity and tolerance, or celebration of different worldviews and philosophical systems. Some see indigenous knowledge as providing alternative to the capitalist, individualist moral system of the Northwest and has been blamed for damaging the planet and compromising the survival and quality of life of future generations. Obamsawin, 1993. Pragmatic reasons for valuing indigenous knowledge are many. Indigenous knowledge is perceived as having developed over time as a dynamic response to the challenges of survival and development in a specific context. It is place-based knowledge, which fits with current paradigms of ecosystem research that link elements of a system within micro-units in space and time. Indigenous knowledge is integrated within culturally mediated worldviews and tends to be holistic in nature. The holisticism of indigenous knowledge is in contrast with the Cartesian mechanistic rationalist philosophy that dominated Western science for centuries. Okoli, 2003. Cartesian thought has been challenged by more recent scientific theories such as relativity and quantum theory. Morgan, 2003, page 39. And ecosystem or ecological theories advocate a more holistic approach that is coherent with many indigenous philosophies, scientists, development practitioners, conservationists, political advocates, and profit seekers have different motivations for pursuing indigenous knowledge, although they may often overlap in their methods. Within the development paradigm, which is of primary interest for the present discussion, incorporation of indigenous knowledge is seen as a more effective way of attaining development goals, giving past futures of technical and technological fixes rooted in Western society. Evans and M.Ed, 1994, argue that knowledge of childbearing practices and beliefs in the field of early childhood care and development is important to 1. Understand, support, and improve child-rearing processes. 2. Respond to diversity. 3. Respect cultural values. 4. Provide continuity during times of rapid change. Hyde and Kabiru, 2003, and Pence and McCallum, 1994, argued that interventions are more successful when built on local knowledge. Many development agencies are now articulating the importance of understanding local knowledge and practices and, consequently, of designing importance of understanding local knowledge and designing cultural appropriate interventions in the field of early childhood development. We can cite amongst other UNICEF recent knowledge, attitude and practice studies, and the Bernard Van Leeuwen Foundation's Growing Up in Indigenous Societies initiative. The World Bank's Indigenous Knowledge Program includes components touching on early childhood development. For example, looking at indigenous knowledge to reduce maternal mortality, as does the UNESCO and NUFIX collaboration. There is also recognition within the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child of the importance of the child's right to cultural identity. The gap between knowledge and practice, the movement to collect, document, and analyze indigenous knowledge began in the first fields of agriculture and natural resources. Botanical and medicinal knowledge remain the dominant field of investigation on indigenous knowledge worldwide, but the approach has been gradually spreading to include other fields, amongst which is community development, linked with infant, child, and youth development. Despite the existence of a great wealth of knowledge on local cultural practices in the fields of child rearing, education, and socialization, this knowledge is not yet being sufficiently or systematically integrated into the programming of development interventions in the field. A lack of progress in this respect is also evident in the case of agricultural and ethnobotanical indigenous knowledge. A variety of reasons exist for the failure globally to translate a respect for indigenous knowledge into practical applications within development realm. In Africa, we can suggest a number of possible explanations, amongst which are the narrowly didactic education system inherited from colonial regimes, and the consequent westernization of the approach of African decision makers and policy implementations. Social changes resulting in the loss of or irreversible transformations in indigenous knowledge. The pressure of globalization in the realms of culture and technology, the lack of contemporary research on indigenous knowledge, conceptual frameworks that remain Western in their foundation and hence are not able to adequately incorporate indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and poor training for early childhood development teachers and practitioners. Both Okoli and Morgan, an African and an Australian indigenous scholars, respectively, level criticisms directly at the primary institutions involved in the knowledge industry, universities and research centers, for their failure to recognize multiple ways of knowing and the consequent tendency for indigenous knowledge to remain unincorporated in current curriculum and theories. This paper argues that the case for integrating indigenous knowledge in higher education is not hopeless, notwithstanding previous performances. The authors propose the generative curriculum model as an effective means of integrating indigenous knowledge without requiring the westernization of this knowledge or the privilege of one paradigm over another. This article presents the case of the early childhood development as an example of an effective way of transforming tertiary educational approaches to accommodate and advance the integration of indigenous knowledge within appropriate epistemologies, as well as apply this knowledge in the promotion of development. The following sections illustrate this approach and document its outcome to date. Promotion of the use of indigenous knowledge in early childhood development. The promotion of the use of indigenous programs places indigenous knowledge, local culture, and contextual learning at the heart of its curriculum. Both the generative approach to learning and the content of the early childhood development curriculum promote respect for indigenous knowledge, although not unquestioningly, just as there is neither a priori acceptance nor